those of you who are not from Chicago, I actually oversee the pastoral services here in the Archdiocese, and so it's a great pleasure always to welcome people to this beautiful city. And especially because we are here in the Archdiocese, we are at kind of a interesting point for us as we go through this transformation called Renew My Church, which is all about trying to figure out who we are and how we are present to people in our time and age, right? And that's a question I think a lot of you ask or at least we should ask in our Catholic schools and in parishes, right? Not only who are the people who are coming and receiving the education, the families, but also how can we meet their expectations, how can we appreciate their expectations, and answer them in a way that the gospel informs us. So that's the starting point. The starting point, right, is kind of looking back and saying, well, what did Jesus do? How did Jesus make disciples, right? Because the probability is if Jesus did it, then if we would do similar thing, we probably would be somehow there, right? Our idea that we can actually outdo Jesus on evangelizing is probably a false idea. So we don't actually have to do better than Jesus did. We just have to somehow use the methodology that he used, right? And I think by the end of the day in the church over the last 50 years, that really has been kind of something that the church has been seriously looking back at, is asking ourselves, well, how are we a church in this changing world, and how can we help people, especially young people, to encounter Jesus Christ? And of course, Jesus did it through the stories, right? He did it because he paid personal attention to people. He went to meet them. He was in the relationship with them. That relationship somehow grasped their imagination, helped them to envision themselves being in the relationship with them, and that in itself, by the end of the day, changed their lives. So by the end of the day, it is about relationship, right? We come and we recognize that all that we do in a church, all that we are relational body, right? We are bringing people into relationship with God through the relationships that we have with each other. The problem is we live in a society which is very disjointed, right? When we suffer with very few relationships. And so how do we do it? And what are the best practices of doing it in a way that people can recognize that they actually have a need for it, but also that we can challenge our own methodology, our own mindset of doing that. When you think about it, right, the statistics are pretty bad. Anybody who would look at our statistics and our probability of success would be a little bit worried, right? So in my day job, I teach in business school. I finished business school, and so I teach business students, and I do a lot of stuff on strategy and on planning. And when you look at our statistics, you kind of step back and you say, okay, we are in a little bit of a problem, and a little bit means to be, a funny word, right? Because when you look at our numbers right now, 86% of the kids that are confirmed will leave the Catholic Church by the time they're 21, right? 86%. So almost 9 out of 10 kids walk out of the church just in 7 years since they graduate from 8th grade. Well, that's a very bad statistic, right? So that's a statistic that for us in the church should actually make us stop, do anything that we do, and reconsider doing something differently, right? The truth of the matter is we actually don't do it. We look at the statistic and we say, boy, that is really, really bad. And our response to it is, we do what we always done. We say, well, now we open our books on page 36 and we'll go through this class. I'm like, are you kidding me? Did you just hear it, what I said? It's not working. So why are you doing what's not working? It actually is not working, right? And we have to just own it. If it would be working, it would be a different story. But we just struggle with it. So if it's not working, then we have to kind of step back and say, well, what it would work, right? What would we have to redefine or rethink that it would work? And I think this example that I started with, right, with the story of Jesus, there is a lot of things that we should really learn from the scripture, I think, in a way that we share our faith and inspire others to do so. Because it was meant to be relational, right? It always meant to be an inviting of somebody to enter into relationship, and it was sharing of that relationship between the people that actually made a difference in their lives. So what we became really over the last 50 years is we became an experts to teach people things about Jesus. We are actually very good to teach people things about Jesus. What we became very mediocre at is sharing with people who Jesus is. There's a difference between knowing things about Jesus and knowing Jesus. And we are very good telling people things about Jesus. We are not so great about sharing our own experience of Jesus with others, right? And I think that always is a starting point for our parishes or for our schools. It's not about teaching them really what's in the books. The books are just meant to be help to us, right? What really the invitation for us is to look at ourselves and say, how are we witnessing our faith, right? How do we invite our students, our families, and our parishes to enter into the relationship that we have, so they can see how that relationship with the Lord makes a difference in our lives, so they themselves might consider it, right? That really is a big thing, because unless that's the only way this will work. I mean, really, right? Because when you think about how did Jesus convert people, right? He didn't do it by fear. He did it through love, right? It was the invitation to encounter the love of the Father through Jesus that converted people's hearts. Well, think about it. Are we using the same methodology most of the time, right? Do we convert people through love, or do we convert them through our other methods, right? And the probability of those methods actually working are pretty low. They're pretty low because first, Jesus didn't use them, so I don't know why we would think they would be better. And secondly is that if it's not love, then it has to be fear. And fear will never work with faith, right? Because faith cannot be based on fear. It has to be based on freedom. We know that. And so I think that's the starting point. The starting point is really to recognize the power of relationships, but also the power of our own witness, right? The Second Vatican Council actually had a lot to do with it. Because when they went to think, when John the 23rd called the fathers, the bishops, the experts to the Second Vatican Council a long time ago, the question on their mind was, how do you speak about tradition in the church? Because until the time of the Second Vatican Council, until 60s, what the church would say is, we are the mystical body of Christ. Therefore, everything around us changes except for us. We don't change. Everything changes. And John the 23rd didn't kind of like it. Not only he didn't like it, the idea was that it wasn't working, right? The church is actually, none of the popes call the councils because the things are going great in the church. They call the councils because the things are really going south. And that's where the church was in the 60s. Even though, people who are way younger than I will glorify the time before the Second Vatican Council. I'm like, guys, none of the Pope who had any smarts would ever call a council if the things were not going wrong. And they were not going any good because people were just disconnected from the church and their own faith, right? So he called the councils, and one of the main topics for the Second Vatican Council was, well, how do we talk about tradition? And I think that's where you see this beautiful new beginning of our own language, when we not only speak about the church as a mystical body of Christ, now we talk about it as pilgrim people. So we say we are on the pilgrimage from the beginning of times to the time when Jesus comes again. And because we are on a pilgrimage, because we are pilgrim people, we have to change because the world around us changes. So of course, in our essence, sacramental essence, we always will be the same. But there's a lot of things that have to change. And the Gaudium et Spes, which is the pastoral constitution on the church that the council came up with, speaks about, right? It speaks that we have the responsibility of reading signs of times and applying them so we actually can wake up in a reality that to which we can speak in an intelligent way, in a way that inspires the hearts, the minds of our families, right? Of people that we have in our parishes and in our schools. So in many ways, where we came from is this age of Christendom. And in that age of Christendom, Christianity was given, right? So especially, when you look at North America, right? And here in Chicago, that was certainly true until, 20 or even 30 years ago. There actually were whole neighborhoods here in the city when people wouldn't meet on Friday. It was given. It was absolutely given in the city, right? Now, I teach at Loyola, and I would go to my students, and I would, on Friday, and they would say, Father, what do you eat for lunch? And I would say, oh, I'm actually not eating anything because there's land. And they're like, what's land, right? And it's only 20 years down the road, right? I mean, they have no concept whatsoever. But when you think about it, our parishes and schools still are built for this old age, right? So we presume that people know way more than what they know. So we presume that when people show up to church or come and sign up students to our schools, that they actually know a lot about their faith, and they spend a lot of time talking about it. And yet at the same time, we know that's not the case, right? So when we start the Mass, we start using, our liturgical language, which is wonderful if you understand the liturgical language, if you know what we are talking about. But if you don't, well, excuse me, it's kind of a boring experience. Because guess what? It's the same week after week after week. So how exciting that can be, right? But the point is, so many of our communities lack this entry points that because there's nothing else, the Mass become the entry point. So if you would want to invite somebody, what would you invite them to? A lot of people say, well, I would invite them to Mass, right? Well, why would you do that? If somebody's just starting learning Chinese last week, you wouldn't invite them to a Chinese birthday party when everybody would be speaking Chinese, right? They would feel crazy, right? You would invite them in something that will use one sentence of Chinese and the rest will be in English. So that's the point of our, with introducing people to the life of faith. We actually do have to introduce them. We have to figure out the way how we are going to get to it. And I think that's very true for our students. I spend a lot of time studying millennials with Barna, which is a big organization that does a lot of study on faith practices in the world. And some of their faith practices and study came up in January. And it says few important things which really are important for you guys, because those are the parents of your younger students, right? Of the kids who will be coming or are coming to schools right now. So one thing that we know for sure is that majority of young people today are overconfident when it comes to their spirituality, right? So they would say about 90% of millennials would say today that they are very much satisfied with their spirituality, where only 17% would say that religion plays a role in it, right? So we are spiritual, but we are not religious, right? So we are moving into this new apostolic age, which is very different, right? Because not only that the tradition, that the language is not known to people or not understood by it, but also that the actual idea that you exercise spirituality through organized religion, that whole idea is just going out, right? That just most of the people don't actually believe that anymore in today's world. So how do we address that? How do we speak to people about it in the intelligent way, simply knowing where they're coming from, right? Because they're not coming from this old reality, but most of them are coming from a very different place. And so how do we meet them? How do we speak to them? How do we form them in faith and invite them into celebrating those special moments for us in a way that it's meaningful to everybody? It's a challenge, but also it's an opportunity, right? So this switch happened over time, over the last 30 years. And the point is, I see it all the time in Chicago. Maybe wherever you're coming from, maybe your dioceses are just, much better than we are at it. And that's a high probability. But But where we are is, we go through this cycle. I always laugh about it, but it's very true. So our pastors don't know what to do with it because, for about 70% of our students and families from school don't come to church, right? So our pastors get really upset about it, and they would say, well, it's the principal's fault. They don't bring the, and the principal says, it was the pastor's fault, he doesn't spend enough time in the school. And if the pastor and the principal are friends, they would say, it was the teacher's fault because they're not really. And the teachers are saying, give me a break. It's the parents. Like, what can I do? I do what I can do best, but I can only do so much in 45 minutes. So if they don't have this whole experience at home, what do you want me to do? There's nothing I can do, right? So we are playing this game of blaming each other. The truth of the matter is, there really isn't anybody to blame. The world just dramatically changed around us. And we as a church, we are not good with actually acknowledging it. We still kind of, when you look at our parishes, they still look like they would, you could just take them, move them to 60s, drop them in the midst of 60s, and they would look exactly the same as they look in 2019. They're not all that much different. And so that's part of our problem, right? Our expectation where people are coming from, what experiences they have, how they think about the world, is as it was 50 years ago, and they're just in a very different place. Our students are in a very different place, right? So how do we have this discussion? I'll give you a great example. My own godson, now, after a year of working on him, he is getting better, but he was scheduled to do First Communion last year. And, he goes to Catholic school and so forth, and his family is pretty practicing. And so we are heading, I think, in a good direction. And then at one point during Sunday Mass, about like 3 months before First Communion, he turned to his mom during the Mass, during the consecration, as the priest was elevating the host, and he said, "That's a myth." And she was like, "What do you mean a myth?" But that's what he heard, right, in school from some of his classmates. So they decided to pull him out and say, we actually will choose not to give him First Communion this year because we're actually not sure he actually gets it or at all believes it. Now, the saddest part is the teacher who was teaching him said he's the best prepared kid in the classroom. And the parents still decided to pull him out. And actually, it was a good thing because he is going to do it in a few weeks. But it seems like he actually saw that this was super important to the whole family. So the way he now approaches it is with way more respect than he did last year. Of course, probably additional year makes a difference too. But it's an interesting thing, right? The second grader comes and says this is a myth. And, our parishes or schools most of the time say, good luck, parents. You deal with it. We don't know how to deal with it. So you go and figure out something, right? And I think that's where our partnership, that's why I started with relationships, right? We lose our people and we lose the opportunity because I think we abdicate sometimes people in those most challenging moments in their parenting around faith, right? When it comes to conversation about what's deepest on our faith, when it comes to conversation on sexuality in our faith, most of the time as a church, we just step away and say, you deal with it. We don't want to deal with it. But make sure you come on Sunday, right? And people say, well, give me a break. You're not helping me, right? You're just leaving me on my own. And I think so that's one area in which we really have to kind of figure out a clear way how, through building of the relationships with the parents, with our communities, we can start engaging them in this practice of faith, right? So Pope Francis actually has a pretty good idea about it. And it comes from Evangelii Gaudium, but actually Evangelii Gaudium is built on his Aparecida document, which I will show you in a moment. But this is what he says. He says, I dream of a missionary option that is missionary impulse capable of transforming everything so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for evangelization of today's world rather than her self-preservation. When you think about that, our biggest problem right now in the church, I think, is self-preservation. We look at ourselves as somebody who's really trying to self-preserve our own structures, right? versus step away from our structures and say, some of those are just not working. And so how are we going to look at differently in our sacramental prep? How are we going to look at differently at how we accompany the preparation of our kids in different ages for learning about faith? How do we allow them to have experience of faith, not just listen the stories that we perhaps have prepared for them? There's no doubt this is a huge challenge. And I usually, when I go to a lot of places and I have this quote, people really like that. And then I always say to people, well, how many of you are willing to change your customs and way of doing things and times and schedules? I mean, have you ever tried to change a schedule of masses? They would crucify you. There will be 2 crosses from that Sunday on in your church. No, it's true. It's actually not funny at all, believe me. Right? Language and structures. I mean, people go crazy. The problem is who gets crazy is the 20% of people that we have. And for some reasons, 80% are not there. But we never ask why 80% are not there. We are just so preoccupied with 20% that are there, that are running the show, that we actually never ask ourselves, well, how about those 80? How are we actively going after the 80%? And most of the time, we are just not. We are just allowing the 20 to control everything as more and more people, right, are walking out of our church every single year. So we've done here in Chicago, right, we are going through this renewal process called Renew My Church. And as part of this process, we are trying to engage a lot of groups we work with a number of dioceses and parishes and a lot of national organizations around the world, trying to figure out the best way in which we can help our parishes to really think differently about how to be a parish and a school in this new reality of the world, right? So what is that absolutely has to change for our parishes to really start growing? Now, the good news about it is that there are parishes that are absolutely growing, and they're not growing. So there's 2 temptations, right? One is to grow based on the fact that, you open a church and there wasn't a church and you're growing, or, you open new mass in Spanish or Polish or Vietnamese and people are just coming and you're growing. That's one way, but that's a false growth, right? Because those people were already disciples of Christ. You're just offering a service that you didn't offer before. Or the second one is you just become much better as a church and you're just still disciples of somebody else, right? So you just become much better. And so people say, boy, the homilies are better, the music is better, I would just come to that church. Quite frankly, that's my parish right here in the city. We still a lot of people. We have unbelievable services on Sunday. So a lot of people come to us. But do we really make new disciples, right? Do we really every year, right, bring people into relationship with Christ that didn't have that relationship? We are probably not all that great with that either, right? So that really is the question. How to build a parish that is capable to do it. And the nice part about it is, or a hopeful sign about it, is that there are places that are actually seeing this growth of people coming into relationship with Christ and therefore deepening their relationships with the church. So the starting point for us, at least here in Chicago, was really kind of digging into this document called a Parecida. So Parecida was a document that was written by the bishops in Latin America. And Pope Francis was, when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he kind of was the architect of the document. So Evangelii Gaudium actually is kind of a continuation of it. And the bishops in Latin America were rather concerned about the fact that people are leaving the church, right? That the young generation is not there. And so their situation was not all that much different than our situation here in the States. And they said there are 4 reasons for which people actively disengage from the life of the church or not interested, right? The first one is that they never experience a profound and intense personal relationship with Jesus Christ, right? That's the starting point. So again, that's the example that I use, right? Is we talk a lot about, we teach a lot of things about Jesus. We forget to create space for people to encounter Jesus themselves, right? So that's the starting point. The second one is did not have meaningful community life where each felt accepted, valued, visible, and included. That's one of the biggest problems in our church, is that if you are in a large place, how do you know that there's new people? How do you know that somebody's missing, right? And if we don't know that, then how are we of value to them, right? And again, we live, whether we like it or not, and we live in a very, in a society which is really, based on transactions. And so people look at it at a very transactional way. What do you provide for me? So I would provide something for you, right? I will belong as long as you, right? And that's just the reality of the world that we have. Whether it's good or bad, that's another thing, but that's just a reality. The third one is unmet desire for biblical and doctrinal formation that is filled with spiritual growth. So it's not only called knowledge, but also it's accompanied with relationships. And finally, seeking missionary commitment that moves the members outside of the pews to serve people outside of the parish or a church. So those four are kind of a foundation. When you look at it as, what we do here in Chicago, you would say to every of our pastors is, look at your community and ask yourself, right? Do we meet those four objectives? Do we offer some way for people to have profound and intense personal encounter with Jesus Christ, right? And some would say, yeah, we do. We have adoration. People can come to adoration. I'm like, yeah, that won't work, right? Because you have to have the language, you have to understand what is going on. So there's a lot of things that have to be there, right? What do you have for somebody who has nothing, who understands nothing? What's your starting point, right? That really is a good question to ask ourselves, right? So for our schools, is if we have expectation that people will have, ongoing faith life, well, what's the starting point? If they start nowhere, where do we start with them? The Barna study that I talked about a few minutes ago actually points out to two very important things that they would say have to change over time for us to really be able to engage people in a practice of faith. So they say the first movement is from proclamation to conversation. They say people do not want to be proclaimed, they want to have a conversation about faith, right, in our culture. So when you think about it, we make a lot of statements about faith that we actually make people, we say that's something you should believe, versus having a dynamic conversation that creates the space. That's one. And the second is the movement. So the first one is proclamation to conversation. The second one is a movement to engagement, right? Around how do we engage people in a dialogue that actually engages them in the life of the community, in a smaller community of faith, that people feel nourished and somehow encouraged and get back to it. And that experience can lead them to experience the life of faith, right? The life of Christ. So those charismatic points, right, that we are starting point, those are the most important things that we really should pay attention to, starting points in our parishes, in our schools, right? I'll give you a good example. So maybe 2-3 months ago, I had somebody who came before our Saturday evening mass. And it was a young woman, and she said, can I talk to you? And I said, absolutely. I have about 4.5 minutes before I will start the mass, but you have 4.5 minutes, sure. And she said, well, I just struggle a lot. I lost my job for the second time this year, and my whole family is in Mexico, so I don't have family here, and I just don't know what to do, and I don't know how I will pay my bills. And she was just bawling, crying, right? And I was like, great, I have 1 minute left. I will pray for you, but I have to go, right? We see that's the problem, right? For a lot of our communities is we actually are not communities. We are a provider of services to our people. We provide a lot of liturgical services. But when you step back, you say, well, how are we accompany a person like that? Right? She doesn't need the prayer. What she needs is a community which will uphold her and help her to go through this struggle, right? And you think about it with schools is exactly the same thing, right? And the more we can build a community around it, right? The more we can have a meaningful community around our parishes and our schools, the more people will belong to it, right? Because we all have this need of belonging, right? We are not created to celebrate our lives alone. We are created for community. We are created in relationship with God and for relationship with God and each other. The problem is that sometimes in the busyness, our communities just abandon that, right? Our parishes just abandon it. So when you think about it, I think that creating as many of those starting charismatic points of how do you bring people into relationship with Christ, how do you help them to learn about their faith at the slow pace is very important. We actually here in Chicago, we use Alpha, which is a program which comes from the Anglican Church. But it kind of introduces people to the life of faith without any theology, right? It's basic charisma, which is a basic learning of who is Jesus. And then out of that, we lead people to something we call small fellowship groups. So once somebody goes through Alpha, and they go through it, for 11 weeks or so, we would say, great, now once you finish it, you can go back to it and help to run it for the next group. And then the question is, or you can join the, kind of a fellowship group, which is about 25 people, which means monthly, and there's a meal and a conversation, and there's a witness talk. And so it's meant to actually help people to recognize how God has at work in their lives at that very moment. So it becomes this conversation-based, experience-based belonging versus just listening, right, on what we say and how we think about parish life. Any questions about that? Boy, that's you guys are an easy group. Actually, by now I have a ton of people arguing with me. So that's good. Well, good, because then I will actually transition to Ted, who is from the Diocese of Brooklyn, and he's the Secretary for Formation and Education there. And so he will pick it up and speak a little bit about missionary discipleship and about how to infuse that with the idea of actually helping people to recognize where Jesus is and how to practically do it. So
thank you, Father
you want me
Peter.
to switch it for you?
Yes, and Father Peter will be so nice and switch the
oh, I will do anything you want me to.
The slides for me, but it's good to be with you today. A few facts about the Diocese of Brooklyn. First of all, has anyone ever had any time to spend in Brooklyn? Does anybody ever have relatives who come from Brooklyn? Almost everybody I meet has somebody who at some time came from Brooklyn. I've never lived in New York. I've never lived in Brooklyn. I live in Connecticut. And I go every day to Brooklyn to visit, as I say, the great areas of Brooklyn and Queens. But it's a great pleasure to be with you today. As Secretary for Evangelization and Catechesis, it's important for me to try to get a sense of the needs of the people of the Diocese of Brooklyn and Queens. The Diocese of Brooklyn has always been among the top 5 largest dioceses in the United States. We have just over 1.6 million Catholics. The diocese is about 15 miles across and about 18 miles from north to south. But it could take you 3.5 hours to get from one end to the other, the diocese. Everywhere you look, there's a church. One time, over 350, now 186 parishes. So it's very hard to imagine that the Holy Father would come to the United States, land at JFK Airport, and the first thing he would say to Bishop DiMarzio is, I'm glad to be in the peripheries of the United States. But that's important for us because it reminds us that the work of missionary discipleship belongs to each one of us. Missionary discipleship can take place anywhere. If you think way back, now I'm much older than Father Peter, and I remember back in elementary school collecting money during Advent for the pagan babies. And that money would be given to the missionaries who would come from the area. In fact, we're presently fostering the cause for Bishop Ford, who was one of the first missionaries from the Maryknoll Missionary Association. He was bishop in China before he was martyred. So the work of missionaries in Brooklyn and Queens has a long, long history. But we recall in the first slide that we're going to take a look at today is actually that of the Holy Father, because he is a huge supporter and proponent of this idea of missionary discipleship. But he always says there's two different aspects there, that of being a missionary and that of being a disciple. So the old thought of missionary was that you would leave your current place and go to some place where Christ wasn't present. Or well, if he was present, he wasn't that well known. Today, I think we can all realize that we don't have to go much farther than even within our own family to know that Christ isn't always present in the midst of his people. As Father Peter was mentioning, as diocese, as archdiocese, we can do as much as we want in terms of programming and initiatives and working with the people who are present among us. But what about the huge majority of people who are not present, who may have been present, who may have been disconnected, who may have never been connected? I think we always think that every church was always packed every weekend, that, we were fending people off and so on and so forth. And people who are old enough will tell you that wasn't the case either. It was always a little bit of the twisting of the arm to be sure that we could have people know and encounter Jesus Christ. This picture comes from the World Meeting of Families in Ireland. And I always remember that in Ireland, where you would think again that every single person you met had some active connection to the church, most of the people I met really were disconnected or had no affiliation at all. And they were looking to the United States. People would come to me and say, well, what do you do in the United States that keeps people coming to your churches? Because, we have these churches, but we have nobody coming. In the United States, we say, we have these churches and we have nobody coming. A few weeks ago, I happened to be with a visitor from Rome, from the Pontifical Council for the Evangelization of People. And he said to me, the difference between Europe and the United States in terms of mission is that the faith still resides in the majority of active Catholics. Where in other countries, and especially in Europe, there's not even that glimmer of hope. So the Maryknoll missionaries have a huge place right on the Hudson River in New York. And of course, they were one of the founders of this notion of missionary work. So they were United States people who went out and did missionary work. None of that building is used anymore for that type of work. You can go there, you can rent it, you can have retreats, you can do it, but it still stands as a symbol of missionary work, Maryknoll and the missions in terms of our old idea. When the Pope came to JFK Airport, he met with sisters who came from South America to be missionaries to us in Brooklyn and Queens. So it's really a juxtaposition of this notion of missionary work. We always thought we were the, big spenders by sending people out to the rest of the world. Well, now we need people. So they were among the first. We have, our bishop is behind the Holy Father, Bishop DiMarzio from Newark. In back there is Bishop Cisneros, originally from Cuba, came to the United States in the Peter Pan mission when he was just a teenager. We have 8 auxiliary bishops, each one of them representing a different culture in the diocese. But their work, as much as our work, is missionary in nature. Now, what are we to do? That's the question. We could be here all day talking about the past, but as Father Peter was referring to, what can we presently do? Well, it's a threefold mission as far as I see it. We need to help others encounter Christ. Basically, how I interpret that is the people we meet every day, the people we work with, the people in our families, the people in our classrooms, the people who come to pick up their children. Everybody needs an encounter, and they need to see Jesus. We need to teach others about Jesus, not necessarily only using books. Oftentimes, I say to groups of people when I speak to them, all I ever wanted to do from the time I was about 7 years old was be a teacher, because everybody in my family was a teacher. I had a superintendent, uncle who was a superintendent. I had sisters my blood sisters who are older than I am, sisters that I had in school that taught me how important it was to teach and so on. I got to teach a year and a half. One morning, I got a knock on the door, and it was the pastor of the parish with whom I was friendly. He said, "Ted, did you ever consider being principal?" He was always kidding, as usual, and I thought, well, yes, but I can't get into this conversation. I'm teaching 7th graders religion, and you could tell by the racket in the room that it was a little bit of a struggle. Unbeknownst to me, during the course of the day, he fired the principal. At the end of the day, he said I was going to be the principal. Well, the problem was I was 3 years out of school, let's say, for example, 24, and the next oldest teacher there was about 60, and everybody else was a nun. So they weren't very happy when the pastor said, now you have to report to me. So I did that for a while. So I spent the next 12 years in Catholic school education, having to close, unfortunately, 3 schools along the way, because they'd always send me to close the school. The nuns would leave, I'd go, and my job was to close the school. I had the privilege of working in a Ukrainian Catholic school, the only Ukrainian Catholic school on the whole East Coast. It needed to close. So I finally said, perhaps Catholic schools are not my strong suit. Let me try the parish side. Well, then the parishes started closing. So I said, all right, maybe I'm a closer in some kind of ways. But all throughout that, what was the main goal? The main goal was to teach. We had to teach about Jesus. But more importantly, we had to teach who Jesus was. And we had to teach about an encounter that we could have with Jesus that would allow us to share that good news with other people. So no matter what the situation is, no matter who was moving where, no matter where chairs were flying, it was all about trying to keep the good news of Jesus Christ alive. And last but not least, we had to demonstrate service. Those 3 points are important to the mission of the church. Bishop DiMarzio is known for a lot of things, primarily his work in immigration and migration. He's one of the international people who are gifted with being able to negotiated, for example, at the White House recently about the Haitian issue. But he always said to me, immigration and migration is at the heart of the church, but really the work of the church has to do what I do, what I try to do in terms of leading people in the diocese, and that is evangelization and catechesis. Reaching out to others, having them encounter Christ in some way, but also helping to teach them about the faith. So when we talk about discipleship, Pope Francis, in his talk during the World Meeting of Families, said, "So it is that each day Jesus warms us with his love and lets it penetrate our whole being." So I thought, wow, that's, on a huge screen in a stadium in Ireland. He wasn't telling people they needed to learn their catechesis better, they needed to know about the Mass better, all the things that I always thought, well, if everybody knew better, we'd be in better shape. Rather, he said throughout the whole gathering that in many, many ways, we have to be like this notion of Jesus who tells people to go and put out into the deep. Go out to those peripheries. Go to those places where you normally do business, but yet the presence of Christ isn't always available, isn't always present. One of the most memorable scenes at that gathering with the Holy Father in Ireland for the World Meeting was this young very well rehearsed and prepared teenage boy who sang a beautiful, beautiful hymn of welcome from way up in the rafters of this stadium. And all you heard was his voice until on every screen they centered in on this. And it really made me think, because in many, many ways, the work we do, at least in my mind, is like this. You never know who's going to be a recipient of the good news that you spread. You really never know. You preach every day, you talk every day by your example, by your communications with people, and sometimes it feels as though, after 40 years for me, I think back and I think 40 years ago, we had the same struggle. We just used different terminology. We didn't call them missionary disciples, but still they were basically the same struggles. We may have had, and I tell the seminarians that I meet with on a regular basis in our college seminary, I tell them when they say to me, well, what did you do? And they always say it directly to me, as though I had that influence. What did I do to ruin the church? Because now it's a mess for them. They want their cassocks, they want their prayer books. They don't really want to be involved, unfortunately, with the solution to the issues. And I said, it goes way past my, level of expertise or my pay grade. The work of the church is everybody's work. And that's why for us, sometimes I think that this is really the image. I could be standing here talking to you forever, and it may seem to you like I am. But we're trying to get, a few points home, and that is that we don't really know the good that we do until other people are able to share that with the next generation or the next group of people, or the students in your class take something you say and bring it home to a home where the risen Christ may not be that present. Encountering Jesus in any community is really at the heart and soul of what we are commissioned to do. So part of the talk today, and it was a long title, but it had to do with the Great Commission. Somebody tell me what they think the Great Commission is. What's the Great Commission?
Teach and baptize.
Go teach. Excellent. I asked my sisters, I asked a lot of people. They didn't know what the Great Commission was, but that's wonderful. That's wonderful. To go out and teach, to go out and do some good work. But you've got to do it in creative ways, and that's what Father Peter was talking about. We have some very, very important people. All of you are very important in this room, but one person here is very, very essential to something that we found in the Diocese of Brooklyn that I never thought would work, but I'm always a skeptic when it comes to thinking outside the box. When I was in the schools, the biggest thing every year was the spelling bee. How many people remember a spelling bee? Well, I was harassed for years by somebody from one of our beloved book publishing companies. What about doing a religion bee? So I've spent most of my life being surrounded by women in Catholic education. So after a while, they kind of wear you down. And I have all women in my family. So after a while, I learned it's better off just to say yes and to do it. So one of the things we started a few years ago is a religion bee. So we have 3rd, 4th, 5th grade compete together, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade compete together. This is similar to a scene of people preparing for that. But it's taken on, like most things in the church, a life of its own. And I was a skeptic from the beginning. I'm like, they're not going to learn these things, and we're going to be there, and so on. So very short amount of time, and so on. It really has been a wonderful tool for evangelization, because the byproduct of it is parents are very, very concerned that their children do a good job. They want to see them succeed. So it's really become a family initiative, a family issue. And we, year after year, try to stump them by giving them difficult questions and try to see whether their answers are the way they should be and so on. And yet, beyond a reasonable expectation that I would have, it has expanded from 30 parishes and schools to 50 parishes and schools to 80 parishes and schools. And there were people this year who had won the religion bees in previous years and came back to see their brothers and sisters participate. The other thing is, as our bishop, who, if you knew him, would understand this, said, why do the non-Catholics always win? Because they take religion, the study of religion, seriously. More seriously, perhaps, than our own. In a way, he was saying it with a positive thought, and that is, we're reaching out to lots of different people. I just give you that as an example, because a lot of people say to me, I come to these things, and there's never anything practical. But think about that. Think about, for a while, I was responsible for Catholic identity in the schools and the academies of the diocese. A decision was made about 10 years ago to move all of the parish schools to academies, which meant that they had a two-tiered board. The pastors were no longer responsible for the school. They had to say about hiring the principal and their Catholic education that took place on there. But basically, it was run by a lay board and so on and so forth. So the more things that we can do to encourage thinking outside the box is extremely important. So, of course, this missionary option that Pope Francis mentioned is important. The story of the sower and the seed leads us to the next section, and that is ongoing adult faith formation is critical for everybody. So people say, well, they never had formation to begin with. So how do they have ongoing faith formation? I think we have to again take a leap of faith and say, look, they might not know the same things that we had to know growing up. And see, as time goes on, I forget that a lot of people in this room are young, so much younger than I am. So you didn't have to memorize the same things and learn the basics and so on. And a lot of that was an issue, again, well above our greatest expectation. There's decisions made after the Second Vatican Council, for whatever reason, that we went more toward felt and puppets than the catechism. But, you can always look back with hindsight and say, well, if we did this, this would have happened. Now, of course, I think everything is a circle, and we're going back to textbooks that are excellent textbooks. We have online courses that help people at different levels. People much more talented than I am, can take them on their cell phones, and I'm always amazed, how little people can get in here and do all that, but, you can take a course online, and we can keep track of it. One of the things we're going to see are happy people, and that is that, people at different ages now are participating in the life of the church as we know it. There's 4 types of formation, and you'll see why this is important as we go along. Human formation, spiritual formation, intellectual formation, and pastoral formation. Who could tell me which is the one that most people would say everybody does or everybody should do out of those 4? You could say, instead of intellectual formation, academic. Academics, right? Most people say, from my point of view, if you take an academic course and you learn a little bit, you're going to be better off, right? Again, people who are much better off than I am will tell you, really, human formation, spiritual formation, and pastoral formation are the key to developing missionary disciples. We need all 4 of these. And that's also a challenge. Sometimes we concentrate more on one because we like it. I'm much more comfortable teaching a class about something than sharing with people human formation. We had in our institute, we have a pastoral institute, a Spanish institute and an English institute. And we have worked with different kinds of inquiries and assessments and so on. So these particular meeting, this presenter in Spanish was speaking to this group, and telling them how gifted they are and how their surveys told them their strengths. Strength Finders, if you took it, was the instrument we used. And now I know very little Spanish. And the people started crying and they're hugging one another. And I'm thinking, what did this woman say to make them so upset? So afterwards, I asked a person on my staff who was fluent in Spanish, and she said, oh, no, Ted, they weren't upset. They were the opposite. No one ever told these people who had been working in catechetical ministry for years and years that they had gifts and talents. And we recognized them. It was amazing to me. Because I'm thinking, I don't know, well, how can they score 80% on the test that I'm going to give them at the end of this thing to pass? It's probably not about that at all. It's probably about how now that gift of knowing that they received acknowledgement from somebody in authority, as they imagine it in the church, gifted them in so many different ways. And so their leadership now has doubled, tripled, quadrupled. They want to volunteer. Some folks were at a Congress we had a few weeks ago. If it weren't for those volunteers from this class that'll be graduating in May and moving on to ongoing formation, it would have been a much more difficult experience. They were wonderful in that. You know, people say, well, ongoing formation is very difficult. I hear from dioceses across the United States all the time. What can we do about it? Well, we had to make some major leaps a few years ago and say that we would accept from our teachers in the schools and the academies and our catechists and catechetical leaders and principals, anybody having to do with educational formation in the diocese is required to do at least 10 hours of ongoing formation every year after they get their initial certificate, which are the 4 pillar courses and one on missionary discipleship and one on scripture. And it could be over a period of time. But these are the numbers. For example, there are more than 13,400 people that interact with the diocese in some way for ongoing formation. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have even had 500 people. And we have about 1,400 catechists, teachers, and so on. 14,000 catechists, catechetical leaders, and so on in the diocese. If you keep going down, you know, there's 264,500 plus individual interactions, lessons that people take, whether it's local or larger than that. We have 16,000 plus students who have taken our annual assessment. We do a religious education assessment, either online or paper and pencil, every year for students in grades 3, 5, and 7. So we test them at those levels, and we take that information. Those students aren't tested, their names are not provided to us or whatever, but we get a sense, where do they do best in those 6 tasks of catechesis: creed, morality, prayer, evangelization, the sacraments, and community. Where are they the best? And then how do we help the teachers and the catechists understand that they need to do their professional development based on where their weak areas are? So if they're weak, for example, in scripture, they should take a scripture course, either locally or online. And we offer that throughout the diocese in many, many different ways. And those numbers, you know, we'll have this information available online, so when I know they're difficult, but to me, it's remarkable that we have some way of recording this data because it gives people hope. It says to our parents now, oh, those teachers that we have to bring our kids to in CCD actually know something? Because when I went to school, all we did was color. You know, now we're past that generation, and they're like, all we did was read these books that we didn't know that we had to read and what they were about. So for adult faith formation, so if you're talking about older people, experienced people in parishes, the best thing that we ever did was to roll out something from Renew International called Arise, or in Spanish, Levántate. It's a 2.5-year, 30-week, over those 2.5 years, fall and Lent, small faith-sharing group sessions. So they meet once a week for 90 minutes, 6 weeks in the fall and 6 weeks in Lent, over 2.5 years. We had the first sign-up go around, almost 8,000 people sign up. Most of those 8,000 people never had anything to do with the church before. And when you asked them why, they said they were never invited. They were never invited. So this meant you went, if you signed up, you went to somebody's home, which if you knew Brooklyn, Queens, is a real put out into the deep measure, because people don't have homes where you can have 8 or 10 other people in there. And once we got through all that and worked that all out, we now have about 12,000 people participating on a regular basis in small groups. And I say to the pastors, it's their responsibility to keep this going. It should be like religious education. It should be like a parish school. Outreach to adults is extremely important in the life of our church today. So one of the things that I would urge you to do is to go to the site meetmein.church. Now, I had this long title for a diocesan evangelization plan. It was called The Joy of Encountering Christ, the Family's Hope. I thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. So I bring it to a development team at DeSales Media that does a lot of our work, and who I thought were about 10-year-olds said to me, Ted, it's got to be a little bit more simple than that. I said, what's more simple? The joy of encountering Christ, the family's hope. It says it all. So they said, we'll work on it and we'll get back to you in a little bit. This is what they get back to me. meetmein.church. Like, what in the heck does that have to do with what I just said? So they were able to find, you know how you have .org, .whatever, .net. This is .church, which was amazing to me as well. When you go on there, and I urge you to go on there, all it is, it's a listing of lots of different things that take place in the diocese. It's a consolidated place where people can go. And it gets about 40,000 hits a month, which, again, people much more intelligent than I say that that's remarkable for a diocesan opportunity. But what it did is it showed us that something very simple could have a great outreach to people. This is some of my information. The Diocese of Brooklyn is the only all-urban diocese in the United States. We have no suburbs. We have no rural areas. It has huge challenges because it's a place where people enter the United States, stay for a while, and move on to other places. So stability is not a huge challenge. Stability is a huge challenge, not a huge blessing for us. We have BQ Online Faith Formation, which through the great work of My Catholic Faith Delivered has provided a centralized place where people can go to register for classes, either locally or online, but it also keeps a transcript of their work. So we now can trace about 9,000 catechists. We can tell whether they meet their requirements every year, and if not, we can send them information directly through many different means to say, these are opportunities for you to further your formation. Now, one of the things we have to ask ourselves all the time, and I think we can do this in closing, is, did not our hearts burn within us at some point in our lives? It may not be right now, but the reason we're here today is because at some point in our lives, we've had an encounter with Christ. Our work now is to leave here and help others to encounter Christ, while at the same time helping ourselves grow in our faith and in our love for Jesus Christ. Does anybody have any questions, any thoughts, anything? I always say, anything that you came to today and you said, if Ted doesn't answer this, I'll just leave so disappointed. Yes. No. Excellent question. Renew International. So if you just Google Renew International, has a number of different opportunities for their key is small faith sharing groups. So they're preparing now one for baptism prep. They have this for adults. This adult faith sharing group uses gospels that are related to the season, but they aren't seasonal. In other words, you don't have to worry that you buy the books for year 1, year 2, year 3, but they go along with the fall. It's 6 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving and the 6 weeks of Lent. So the Lenten readings, they're really based on topics that help you develop as a missionary disciple. So the first is getting to know a little bit about the church, getting to know about the social aspects of the church. They follow a certain lesson, but that's an excellent question. I think the books are about $9. The packet for the parish is $350. You can do it any way you want. It's very flexible, but Renew International, small groups to me is the way to go for adult faith formation. Parent groups, anything. Young adults, we had very successful young adult groups who, after the 6 weeks, want to say, well, why can't I keep going? But their key says, if you give people a limited time and limited information, they'll want to grow on their own. And I think that's what we want to do. We don't want to hold hands all the time. Somebody else? You're very welcome. It's always helpful to have one, because as I tell the people in the diocese all the time, I could keep talking a long time, but if you distract me with a question, you're better off. Yes?
That is, I just went on.
Yeah.
It's like what's going on today in the diocese, like in the week. I think that's really wonderful.
It's simple, but it's very effective. And that came out of an initiative that I said, why can't we put all of the evangelization efforts in one place? I'm a big one for consolidation. And we do a disservice, I think, in the church by separating things all the time.
I have a good friend who lives in the diocese of Rockville Center, and she's always she makes it herself.
Yeah.
She sends it to all her friends, like all these different things that are going on at Rockville Center. She makes it. And then I live in the Diocese of New York.
Yeah.
I'm like, I never have this. Like, I have to go to every church's website to figure anything out. And you can't. I mean, who has time? That's why.
So it's very simple things like that, practical things like that. And if you go on these websites, you'll find some practical ideas. To me, that's the most important thing. One last or three last questions. How many people here serve in schools? How many people are teachers or principals? Anybody from a parish situations? All right, good. And anybody not in either of those? Okay. Diocese, yeah, okay. One of the things that I find now, we've more or less transitioned out of just as a diocese notifying the pastors and the principals, and they have a ton of things to do, and I understand. But most of them will say to me, if it doesn't appeal to me, I'm not going to share it. If I can't go, I'm not going to bother with it. So we collect as many email addresses. People can always opt out if they don't want to get it. But that has been the one thing that most people have said to me has made a difference. If we connect with them directly, that's a key. Well, why don't we close with a prayer? Okay, and we'll ask the Holy Spirit to be present with us as we continue. We'll pray in the words that Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Our Lady, Queen of Peace, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Thank you very much.